So welcome to the November edition of the Cerini Connection. In a world where pay transparency is becoming the norm, organizations must adapt. It's not just about compliance, it's about building trust and fairness in the workplace. So I'm happy and lucky to be joined today by Jill Krumholz and Susan Kreeger of RealHR, who'll be unraveling the complexities surrounding pay transparency, addressing some of the legal requirements, the impact on organizations and companies, and strategies for effective implementation. So welcome, Jill and Susan, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks. So before we get started, why don't you guys talk a little bit about, or kind of tell us who RealHR is and what you guys do?
Yeah, thank you, Ken, and thank you all for joining us today. So Susan and I, Susan Kreeger, Jill Krumholz, we are partners with RealHR Solutions, and we are a boutique firm that has national reach, and we are headquartered in New York City. We provide support to for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and we help organizations, help companies in terms of advisory work with senior leadership. We also interface with and support an organization and its employees in terms of HR practices, policies, practices, and strategy. And we also do special projects, which include executive search, salary and compensation philosophy, salary benchmarking, and benefits benchmarking. So we're very pleased to be here. And I think we have a pretty robust content that we want to share with you, and hope you will ask questions.
So yeah, thanks for bringing it up. If anybody has any questions, please just throw them in the chat. This is, again, your opportunity to talk to some people who really have a lot of knowledge around a pretty difficult topic in terms of pay transparency, especially when we're in a world where the world has gotten a whole lot smaller and you've got employees all over the place. So there's been a lot of discussion regarding pay transparency, and I know that back on, I think it was November 19th, New York State passed the law with respect to pay transparency. Why don't we talk a little bit about what exactly is pay transparency? What are the legal requirements associated with pay transparency, and what should people be aware of?
Great. I will jump in on that. And that's a very big question to start with, Ken. Covers a lot of ground. And we thought it would be helpful to look at this topic in a few different ways. So pay transparency, we see as a continuum of things that have been going on actually for decades, historically, around pay equity, other ways that employers talk about compensation, other ways employees get information about compensation. So in my mind, going back to the 1990s with the Lilly Ledbetter Act, which allowed people to sue outside of the 180-day requirement of when you could bring a suit about pay equity, and allow you to be able to move forward with the suit even though the 180 days has passed. So following on with sort of that line, there have been laws around opening up the opportunity for employees to freely speak about their salary. That's something under the National Labor Relations Act. There have also been other requirements about not asking employee history. So all of these things together, the goal is to try to foster pay equity and open up information about salary, which then closes gaps. So it could close gaps around gender pay, could close gaps around racial disparities in pay. So this, we see, long-winded answer of pay transparency is sort of the most recent manifestation of all that. So we wanted to put it in context. This is part of something that's not going away, that's been changing and growing, and pay transparency is here to stay.
Okay, so who is subject to the pay transparency laws? Not is everybody, or is there certain limits, or what?
So pay transparent, depending on what state you're in, and several states, I think about 10 states now specifically have pay transparency laws. New York just passed their law in September 2023, this past year. New York City had a law in place. So depending on where you are, there are different thresholds. So in New York State, if you have 4 employees or more, you are subject to pay transparency laws. California, 15 employees is the threshold. Colorado is 1 employee. So depending on what state you're in, there are different thresholds to who's covered by the law, specifically around compliance.
And one of the things that we will discuss as we move forward, and I'm sure you have lots of questions about this, is if you're in one of those states, but you have remote employees, what are the implications there?
So since you
we'll
brought that up,
certainly be talking
let's talk about it now.
Okay. Okay, we'll just jump right in. Okay.
So
what are the ramifications? Again, I mean, as I said earlier, the world has gotten a whole lot smaller, and I mean, even we're a local accounting firm, but we're hiring people out of state. So what rules do we follow? What laws must we follow? And
all of them.
Okay.
And that is the challenge. It's a real patchwork quilt of different laws in different states, jurisdictions. So what do? If you're located in New York, but you're doing postings in other states, you do have to pay attention to what's required in those other states. If you have remote employees that are going to work remotely but report into New York, then you have to follow New York law and the requirements under New York law. So you really have to pay attention to what's going on, where your employees are located. Some might be located remotely, only work remotely. Others might be hybrid. Others, there's so many combinations that you do have to take into account the different jurisdictions where people are. So what do you do about that is our quest. It's something that we're interested in talking about. But look, Ken, did you have another question around that?
So let's maybe take a little bit of a step back. You talk about postings and stuff like that. I mean, what constitutes a posting? What are, maybe even a broader step back, what are the requirements under the pay equity rules in terms of, or pay transparency rules, I'm sorry, that people need to be concerned about?
So they're things that apply generally. So let's talk about New York. So in New York, just about anything that has information about advertising for a job is a posting. It could be a flyer. It could be something on LinkedIn that's posted. It could even be internal, a posting that you have internally. So I don't think there's anything that could be considered an exception to what is a posting if you're hiring for a job and you make it public.
Okay. And then the pay transparency rules require you to disclose what the salary range is going to be for that position.
Correct.
This way everybody's on the same page is what we're talking about.
Yes, sure. You need to make a best faith effort to determine a range for that position. And it can't be a wildly wide range. It has to be a reasonable range. You can also post an hourly amount. You can post, let's say you want to hire somebody, the job pays $25 an hour. You can post that rate and look for somebody at that rate. You cannot do something like, say, this salary will be 20 and up. That's too general, not specific enough. So you do have to be specific enough with what you're posting.
So that brings up several questions with respect to that. First of all, when I'm looking for a position, let's say a teacher or a nurse or whatever position, and a teacher could have 3 years experience, 5 years experience, 10 years experience, 20 years experience. Am I supposed to give a range of salary for each range of experience? How does that work? Because I mean, if you're looking for someone, you know, and you're saying it's going to be commensurate upon the experience that they have, you're willing to pay somebody with more experience, more money, someone with less experience, less money, or does that just have to be factored into the range?
Okay. I'm going to respond. Go ahead, Susan. Feel free.
But let me just say, while I remember it, I think there are a couple of responses to that. One is how you set your ranges are very important. And that's something that we're going to talk about in a minute, that whole process of determining ranges and setting them. So your range for a particular level of a nurse, say, could be, you know, within 15, 20,000. And that takes into account the different requirements, different level of degrees, levels of experience. You might have a nurse level 1 or level 2, and you would want to post according to what you're looking for. Another thing this makes me think of also, you know, you might be looking geographically for people where salaries are different, ranges might be different. You need to post those individually as well. So if you have somebody who you're looking for to hire upstate, that range geographically might be different than somebody you're looking to hire downstate.
What happens if I'm doing, let's say, a posting on LinkedIn, which could be looked at by anyone, whether it be someone local or someone who's not local, and maybe it's a job that can be done remotely? How do I put a range in for something like that where I'm dealing with, you know, if they're in the New York metro area, I'd be willing to pay one thing. And if they're, you know, out in or down in Kentucky, it's a different thing.
It's going to be something you need to think about. And another thing that this also brings to mind is, let's say you do find somebody who is downstate, maybe requires a higher salary for certain reasons. You do have some leeway to go above what you had in the range. It is a best faith effort. You need to have a good reason to go to pay something different. There is room for that kind of negotiation.
But you said above the range. What about below the range?
That's a good question, Ken.
Yeah, that's I think that's a tougher justification, right? Because, you know, and what I want to share is that this is so holistic in terms of the view of it. So we're really talking about having one, good job descriptions internally, and then secondly, having an appropriate job posting. So if your posting is specific to the particular job and it's specific enough, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what that range is. To your point, Ken, if it's below, I think that becomes difficult.
Right. Okay.
If it's somewhat above, it is not, you know, because there are things that you're just not going to be able to take into consideration. But as Susan said, it's a good faith effort to be within the range. So the more clear you are about what the job is, and you're taking into account that you may want a PhD or you may want 3 master's degrees, you're going to take that into consideration with that range of posting.
And when I set my range, do I have to look at it with respect to what I'm currently paying my staff? Or what happens if, let's say, I've got a staff person who I'm paying outside what I'd want to pay other people? So again, going back to the teacher thing, let's say my normal range for a teacher is between, you know, $40,000 and $70,000, but I have a couple of teachers I'm paying $80,000 to. Can I set my range at, you know, 35 to 75 or 35 to 65 or whatever it is? And then so I have a couple of people who fall outside the range for particular reasons.
So the short answer is yes, you can. But you need to consider it's not just about the compliance with the law. So what is that going to do internally? When you do, and it might be perfectly fine. You say, this person who's getting 80,000 has been with us for a lot longer, has certain specific skills that we really need. You can set a range that's lower. That's not illegal under the law. You could set the range that is appropriate for that range, even though you're paying someone internally differently. it could open up a whole host of other questions around, is this fair? Are you paying people fairly? Even the new people coming in, are you paying them fairly versus the people who've been here? Is it a question of, the people who are getting paid at that 80,000 and up range happen to be in a certain group of people? They might be all white women over a certain age or under a certain age who are in that category. So you'd want to look at that from an internal equity perspective.
Good point.
Yes. Open up other things.
So I think what this leads to is there is the transparency law, and then there is the equity internally and what, as an organization, you choose to do with it. And what's happening with the current situation and the trend is that there really is an onus on companies to start looking at pay, whether it's compensation and benefits as it relates to, their benchmarking. What are they paying against the competition? What is your pay philosophy? What are your pay practices going to be? So it's not just the transparency. The transparency is now influencing how organizations think about their equity and what they're going to do for all of their employees. That's not law, that's best practice.
So you brought up another point there. You brought up benefits. When we're looking at the pay transparency law, does that cover benefits or is that strictly a salary law?
Right now it's salary, and it differs in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, New York State is actually trying to make it, New York City, I think, is trying to make the requirement for employers more stringent in terms of including benefits and things of that sort. At the moment, I don't believe there is a state or another jurisdiction, because there are some cities also along with the states, but I don't think any of them are necessarily requiring that.
So, and there's a difference between whether you include benefits and to look at your salary rate and ranges as far as total comp, and whether you include it just as information about benefits.
Right.
So you certainly can include information, and it's recommended. Mm-hmm. And I believe in some states it is required. I'm not positive about that, but where you do include information about benefits. But it's not part of your salary rate or range at the moment.
Right. So a question did come in that I want to kind of bring up here. So again, going back, I post a salary range. I post a salary range of $50,000 to $70,000 for someone for a specific position. Mm-hmm. Let's say I'm looking for you were talking about before, kind of a nurse level 3, whatever. And I say 50 to 70 for a nurse level 3. Someone comes in at a nurse level 1 and says, I can do this job. I'm willing to learn. I'm very eager. And I like the candidate. I think they're great. And I think, yeah, they can grow into this position. Does that then give me the flexibility? I was talking about, maybe offering a little bit lower. Does that now give me the flexibility to offer somebody less because they don't meet the criteria of the job I was looking for? They meet a different job criteria that I can then look at my range for that job criteria?
It looks like you can make those adjustments. Even once you've done a posting, you can decide that you want to make a change in that. And you found people who seem appropriate at a different level. That sort of answers that question.
I would probably document.
Yes.
What happened. I think with a lot of this stuff, like any law these days, everything needs to be documented, and you need to maybe put something in the personnel file or whatever.
Correct.
Yeah. Oh, always have a business justification for doing what you're doing. Yeah.
And again, I'm going back to job descriptions. If you have the job descriptions for those 2 different jobs, and if you decide to hire at the more junior level, you have that job description. So that is backup for you as well. And the criteria really for filling that job is now changed because you're hiring someone who is less qualified, even if they have potential.
Staying along this path for a second, we talked about, salary ranges. What happens if it's a part-time employee? What happens if it's a temporary employee? How does that kind of come into play here?
So our understanding is you have to post. There are really no exceptions. There are some exceptions for temporary firms hiring people to work for someone else, which is a carve out around temp firms specifically. But you as an employer would need to, if you're looking for somebody in a temp role, in a part-time role, you would still post for those positions.
Okay.
I mean, you still do salary ranges, and pay transparency would come into play.
Right. And then in terms of that posting, what does that posting need to look like? How detailed do we have to get? Do we have to put job descriptions? What has to go into that posting other than the salary range? Are there any changes within the law with respect to that? Sorry, I don't mean to throw weird questions at you.
Okay. There are some jurisdictions that I believe are requiring, and again, you really need to look at your states because we're not experts in all of these states, right? But you really need to look at what state you're in and what information is required. But generally speaking, if you are posting a job, right, you also hopefully have some job description behind you as evidence of what that job really is. And if you're making any kinds of changes, then you're going to want to reflect that.
Yeah, I think it says in the New York State law that you should include a job posting where available.
Yeah.
So
you mean job description where available?
I'm sorry, yeah, job description where available. So
you're not going to do that in a newspaper ad where you're paying by the word.
Exactly.
Well, and that goes back to, and I say this a lot for any of you who've heard me speak, your job posting is really a marketing tool. So now it's not only a marketing tool, but there's some implications, obviously, from a legal standpoint, right? But it's a marketing tool, and it's not only who you are and who you're attracting, but it is, the salary that you're offering. And by the way, and I'm segueing a little bit, which is that you also in having to post this range, there will be people who will no longer be interested when they see what your salary is, right? And that's part of this kind of self-filtering, right? So if your salary is too low, it's very, very possible that they will not be interested if it's too low, right? And then these salary wars come in also.
I just want to make sure to say, with the job description requirement, it's very limited circumstances where you would not post a job description. So if the job title itself was clear enough to say, what this job is, like a dishwasher or something that in the title itself made it clear what you're being asked to do, you would not have to do a job description, but otherwise you should do a job description.
And could a link to a website or something with the job description, could that work instead of having to put it in the specific posting itself, but create a link?
I believe you can. I'm not positive. Susan, you?
I have not seen that, although it's certainly a practice, because that's the way a lot of postings are done now. It links back to a site. So
yeah. Now, having said that, like if you're posting on LinkedIn or Indeed or Idealist, they literally ask you for the salary range. So while you may have a link back to the posting, your salary transparency is being requested on that document so that I, as a candidate, can look immediately at that posting and know how much the employer is paying. So that can't be behind the scenes. Most of the posting companies require it.
Are there any requirements with respect to the pay transparency rules to actually disclose internal salaries, or just when you're to your internal staff, or just when you're going out for a new position and you're trying to hire someone, you have to then disclose the range of salary for a new posting that you put out either internally or externally? And if you are doing one externally, must you also post it internally if you're not looking to promote from within, but you're looking to just go to the outside world and hire? Sorry, that was a long question.
So is your question, do you have to be
So it's
transparent
it's two
internal?
questions, yeah. Well, it's two questions. First, if I'm going to hire someone from, and I'm trying to bring on, let's say, a new nurse, and
Yeah.
I don't have one internally to promote, but I'm going to go to the outside world. Do I also have to post something internally with respect to the salary range for that position? Or
In New
can I
York,
just
yes.
post externally and somebody, if they see it, they see it?
In New York, yes, you do have to post. You have to post the salary.
So even if I'm not looking to hire internally, I'm just hiring externally for a position because I need somebody in my office, let's say, I still have to put something somewhere internally to say what the salary range is for this external job I'm putting out there for.
Will it be on your website?
Yeah.
And that's fine.
Okay.
It's on your
Or it'll
website.
be on LinkedIn, or it'll be wherever I'm advertising
Right.
for this.
Right. And the other piece is there's some jurisdictions where, like California, which is sort of surprising, you don't have to provide the information to an employee unless they ask. I mean, they can information about their own salary and where they fit into the salary ranges unless that person asks, but not about the job that's being posted. The job that's being posted is public information. You can see.
But then that goes back to the second part of the question. So the second part of the question was, is there any requirement to provide a listing to internal employees about what the salary ranges are for the jobs I have, even if I'm not looking for anyone?
Not in New York.
Okay.
No, but that goes back. Go ahead, Jill.
No, I was going to say, at the moment, as we understand it, the law is not, and again, surprisingly, in California and Colorado, which, by the way, was the first state to have pay transparency, but there is no law that we have seen that requires that internal transparency per se, without there being an external job being posted. But this gets into a whole other thing about best practices and engagement and everything else.
Okay.
Susan, agree, disagree, feel free.
No, I agree. I think it gets more complex, but that's something I would definitely advise looking into by state. But there is certainly the broader question of what should you be doing internally because these laws are in place. Do not assume that if you don't have to post internally, it means it's a good idea not to, or you don't have to share salaries. It's a good idea not to, because people will get this information. They can see it publicly. If they're not getting it from you directly, they're going to see it out in the world. They're going to hear about it from each other. And you need to consider how you're handling that. There's no avoiding that. You might choose to limit the kind of information. You certainly might not reveal, and don't have to reveal, individual people's salaries, but to post salary ranges, grades for particular roles. It's probably advisable to do that because the rest of the world is going to see it. Why would you want your internally people not to see it? It also shows people how promotions work, what the leveling is of your organization, where people might want to go in the future. So you need to think about these kinds of issues internally if you don't have that in place. And that all goes around your how you manage your compensation. What is your compensation philosophy? How much information do you reveal and why? Just makes me think we were working with a local New York City employer doing great work at World Not-for-Profit. And just recently, the ED, wonderful to her employees. But when we were talking about pay transparency, she goes, I love fairness. I hate pay transparency. So you have to figure out how you're going to address these things within your organization, because the information is going to get out and you want to control the message about what gets out.
Ken, not to do your job, but Elizabeth asked about the requirement of JDs relative to job postings. And Susan, tell me otherwise, but I believe that there is not a lot anywhere, well, not in New York or City or New York State, that the JD has to be attached to it. You have to have a JD, and best practices to have a JD that you can show the potential employee. It may actually be in your ATS, right? But it's not required with the posting.
I think that's right. You do. Well, I'm not positive that that's right, because I'm actually looking at an FAQ right now from Department of Labor that says an employer must create a job description except in the limited circumstances where the title conveys the job duties. Does that mean it has to be actually physically in the posting, or can it be a link and available?
And there's a vagueness here because job descriptions and job postings tend to be used interchangeably, not only in terms of verbiage, but also some companies, and I'm sure some of you do, use your job postings as your job descriptions. So there's a little vagueness around that. I think one of the things Susan and I are saying by kind of talking, speaking about this back and forth, is there are certainly the laws around the transparency, but then there is a lot of gray area, and it is going to vary. And as more and more states create these laws, and potentially there's a federal law that's being considered, we're going to have to continue to look at this and evaluate it and analyze it.
What do you guys see as maybe some of the challenges that your clients have run across in kind of implementing pay transparency?
One of the things that you brought up already, Ken, comes out, which is all of a sudden they're in this world where they have to reveal salaries to the public, but they have not done the internal work already to justify salaries, to rationalize, even to understand them. Not that people are doing things wrong on purpose, but things just over time. We all know we hire people, we hire somebody great, so we give them a little more money, and salaries get out of whack. And they haven't done that work yet. And they're really worried about, I can't post this because the person who's doing that or a similar job internally right now doesn't get paid that much. So that's an issue that comes up. And sometimes it means doing sort of ad hoc changes that you do need to address. The other issue that came up, we were working with a California not-for-profit. We did a salary ranges for them to prepare them for the January change in their law. And they were way out of line with when we did the benchmarking, they were, even being in the 25th percentile, they were way out of line in terms of where their salaries were. So what did they do about that? And that, one of the ways we've worked with them on that was, what is the communication to your staff? You have to be honest about it. And sometimes budget is an issue. So we put in place a transition plan that over time, there would be increases to bring people up to the right level. So those are some of the things that we are hearing about.
What do you
I would
guys-
also say that, I'm sorry, I would also say that we are seeing more of an urgency, to Susan's point, we're seeing more of an urgency to look for companies to look at what their philosophy is and start to do much more benchmarking and analysis to look at grades and bands than ever before, and the push is enormous. And, we're asked for that all the time. And, I think that Susan and I would both say that it becomes irresponsible of an organization not to look at internal equity as a result of where legislation is going as far as transparency, because that's when you really get into enormous trouble if you ignore what's happening internally, or you don't communicate that you're going to do something about it, and do something meaning at least evaluate it. Right. So the communication piece is really critical, but taking that next step puts a huge onus on employers. It may ultimately cost you more because you need to start changing salaries. And not to scare you, but it's not the Wild West, but certainly there are steps to take in order to be more fair to your organization, and employees are going to hold you accountable. Again, that's not the law. It's about hiring people, engagement, retention, and really fairness to people.
What are you guys seeing out there with respect to companies and organizations starting to adopt pay equity, pay transparency policies? And what do those policies kind of look like?
So what we see, and we're not comp experts, but we do quite a bit of comp for our clients. We see some very basic work being done. One being, are your job descriptions up to date? And do they really capture what people are doing so that you can fairly assess and put even a grade or a range to that job? So we're doing some of that work initially before we can do anything else. We're also looking at, as you look at putting in place salary bands and ranges, you can do with that an analysis of your data to look at which roles might have more of a protected class in them. Are they getting paid less than another role? Is there a business reason for that? So it gives you a good insight into what really is going on within your organization. And are there groups of jobs that have traditionally had lower paid employees that are in a protected class? I will advise, as you do that work, do it carefully. You might even want to bring in counsel to talk things through with you, so that information does remain privileged and protected, because you want to be able to look at it and analyze it and fix it in a way that you're comfortable with. So that is something that is being looked at, and why, which then brings you to, do we need to relook at how we what are the job descriptions and what are the requirements that we're looking for in these roles? So if there are roles that have been typically underpaid, is it because you're undervaluing them based on what they do and contribute to the organization? You need to look at that in a way around the job description. So these are the kinds of efforts that we see on a very micro kind of level.
What are you seeing by way of, and a couple of people have asked, what are you seeing by way of bonuses, and how do bonuses kind of fit into this whole mix? How does that come into play within the salary range? When you developing a salary range, do you consider bonuses? Do you not consider bonuses in the salary range? How does hiring bonuses and stuff come into play in some of those numbers that you're throwing out there?
I would say first that certainly the bonuses while the laws are moving towards potentially having salaries and bonuses being posted, they're not at the moment. One of the things that if in fact you are looking to hire someone, to the extent that you can say within that on your job posting that this position is bonus eligible, that we know we offer robust benefits, you can then get into a dialogue to say, okay, this position pays $100,000, but it's bonus potential, right? But it's not required that you specify that. But that's where the communication comes in. And I think it's important that you know, while you don't want someone to apply who needs $200,000, right? You want to attract people with some of the narrative around your perks, around your benefits. You could say it's bonus eligible, but it's not part of that salary transparency.
And I'll add to that, knowing that we're sort of coming up soon on
Yeah.
our ending. It's a good way to bring us back to what we were addressing in the beginning, which is the question of the bonus will be looked at and addressed by some pay equity questions, because that's also part of compensation. And that's going to be, if you're looking at are people being paid fairly internally, you're going to take into account bonuses, whether or not you post that in a job posting. So all of this kind of fits together as far as what you're looking at, and pay transparency being a part of this broader category of pay fairness, pay equity, and closing pay gaps.
What about union employees and union contracts? You know, how does that fit in, since unions under kind of a structured environment to begin with? And what happens if, you know, you decide to pay someone outside of union scale or any of those things?
There's some labor law questions in there in that
Sorry.
question. Which I am not, neither one of us is a labor lawyer, but you do have to post if it's a union position. You include the grade. It's easy to do that because most of them are specific with a grade and a range. With, if you are in a collective bargaining agreement, you know what those salaries are and what the ranges are. So you do post it. So, but if you're saying, you know, we want to pay less than what the union position is, that's probably a question that you're going to have to discuss with your attorney, because then why isn't that person in the collective bargaining agreement? Why are you paying less? You know, there are reasons then that things might come up around that question for you.
Okay, before we kind of end, I just want to throw out one last question. What are the repercussions of not complying? Fines.
There are fines in New York City. I think you have there's a small window of opportunity to cure if a complaint is filed about not posting. In New York State, there are, I think the first finding of wrongdoing is $1,000 fine. The second is $2,000. And the third is $3,000. And anything beyond that is $3,000 as well. So there are fines for not complying in New York.
Okay, so this was awesome. I mean, I can tell you questions are continuing to come in. What we're going to do is we're going to send out a recording of this presentation. We'll also send out some additional information that Jill and Susan have put together, and we'll also provide their contact information so that anybody can reach out to them. And I had a list of about another 20 questions, which we're still on question number 1 in terms of my questions.
I think we need a part 2.
This was super awesome. So I thank you guys for the time that you spent with us today. And then for everybody else, we are going to be having our next Cerini Connection on December 6th. We'll be interviewing Simon Lewis, who's the founder of the Suffolk County Webmaster, about how to create an impactful website. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see everybody on December 6th. And thanks a lot, Susan and Jill. That was incredible.
Thank you, Ken. Thank
Thank
you, everyone.
you. Thanks, everyone.